Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series. Really sorry for that short interlude where I disappeared for a couple of weeks there. I had emergency surgery because of course I would have emergency surgery in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. It wouldn't happen any other way for me. It was all very traumatizing. It was awful. I've had this chronic pain in my abdomen for the past 5 years. We've had no idea what's caused it. I've had all kinds of tests. I've cut out different foods thinking it was some sort of like food intolerance. It has been the most awful pain. It comes like every few weeks and I literally can't move or talk or do anything for about 12 hours and then it just goes. And I just live life in fear of this pain just suddenly arriving, caused by stress. Always like, it would always happen when I travelled, always. Anyway, nobody had a clue what it was. Turns out it was my appendix. I've had chronic appendicitis for the past 5 years and nobody picked up on it. Nobody. To be fair, the pain wasn't in my appendix region. It was just a general all over horrible pain. So I got rushed into hospital last Friday. When? At some point, I can't remember. 2 weeks ago when this video goes up. 2 Fridays ago. And I was so high on drugs, I was on my own. Can't have anyone with you in hospital in a pandemic, obviously. So I was so high on morphine. I had all these people talking to me. I was hearing the word tumours and inflamed and adhesions, and I was literally there in this like morphine bubble freaking out. And basically my surgeon went in to see what was going on, not really knowing what it was. He thought it might be appendicitis, but also my appendix was so scarred and adhesion from like all the years of having appendicitis that he didn't know if he'd be able to remove it. It was all very awful. Anyway, turns out he did manage to remove it and now I'm appendix free and just lots of holes and scars in my stomach. But you know what? Hopefully I'm never going to get that awful chronic pain again. Fingers crossed. But anyway, you're not here to hear about my appendix woes. You're here to hear about the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, which was a very easily avoidable disaster that led to the deaths of 146 workers, mostly female immigrants aged 14 to 23. It was the deadliest industrial tragedy in the history of New York City, and it led to a huge reform in health and safety laws in the workplace, laws that are still in place across the USA today. For years before this, groups have been fighting for better working conditions and protective legislation for factory workers, but their demands were all falling on deaf ears. It was the women's unions demanding these improvements, and the men in power simply didn't see it as a priority to address, although countrywide fire inspections precautions were simply inadequate by today's standards, or any time standards. It was just all very inadequate back then. Health and safety wasn't really a thing. As always, this video is sponsored by Magellan TV. As you probably know, we have an ongoing sponsorship and I know that so many of you have already signed up to Magellan TV. So today I'm going to make a couple of documentary recommendations first, both of which are great for my true crime loving viewers this month. So first up we have The Monster Among Us, which is a look at a South African serial killer that preyed on a quiet rural village in the Eastern Cape called Theleni. For 3 years, women and children were being periodically killed in this village, and this documentary takes a really deep look into the story and retraces the steps of the killer using police records and expert investigators. It's so good. And the second documentary is called Murder in Paradise, about the murders of British backpackers Hannah Weatheridge and David Miller in 2014 in Thailand. I remember this happening at the time. It was huge in the British media. If you're from the UK, you've probably heard of it as well. So it was really interesting to finally have an overall view of this case in this documentary and to really expand my understanding of what happened. For those of you who haven't signed up yet, Magellan TV is a streaming service dedicated purely to documentaries. I advocate education and bettering yourself and your knowledge at every opportunity, so I really cannot recommend Magellan TV enough. They have everything from true crime, science, history, nature and everything in between, with new programmes added weekly to be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K as well. There's never been a better time to dedicate yourself to learning something new, and Magellan TV is perfect for that. So our story today begins with a Triangle Waist Company, their business being the manufacture of ladies' shirtwaists, a clothing item that you don't hear much about these days. A shirtwaist is a button-down blouse that is originally modelled on menswear shirts. They're very easy to wear and suitable for the workplace. They're often embellished with lace and frills and available in all different colours. They can be worn jacketless or just tucked into a shirt. It was a fashion revelation for the time. The Triangle Waste Company was owned as a partnership by Isaac Harris and Max Blank, who were relatively hands-on owners. The business occupied the 8th, 9th and 10th floors of a 10-storey building called the Ash Building on the northwest corner of Green Street and Washington Place in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, New York City. It's right near Washington Square. On March 25, 2011, there were upwards of 500 people working for the company across the 3 floors, mostly girls and women. I say girls because the youngest employees that day were around 14 years old, children by today's standards, even if they would have been expected to work back in 1911. The standard work week looked like a 9-hour day, Monday to Friday, plus 7 hours on a Saturday with only half an hour for lunch every day. Supposedly, the owners of the Triangle Waste Company never knew how little their employees were paid, nor did they know how many employees they had, so much for hands-on. They subcontracted a lot of the work to individuals who were the ones to hire these employees. These subcontractors would then pay the employees little and then pocket the profits for themselves. A 52-hour work week would earn you anywhere between $7 and $12, and that's not the hourly wage, that's the weekly wage. Adjusted for inflation, that's between $183 and $314 take-home a week. Not much for a lot of work in not so great conditions. Most factories like this one would almost exclusively hire young immigrant workers, mostly Italian and European Jewish, coming over with their families in search of a better life, the American dream, who'd be willing to work in poor conditions for less money. They had to take what they could get. They weren't going to get the high paid work, and most were thankful just to have a job at all. But really they were just being exploited. But the factory was a sweatshop at the end of the day, and this wasn't the first drama that had befallen the Triangle factory. In 1909 there was an incident at the factory which sparked a spontaneous walkout of a fifth of the workers. Although I failed to find out exactly what the issue was, it was to do with the working conditions. Owners Harris and Blank then went on to lock all of the workers out of the factory entirely, and they hired sex workers to replace the strikers. The Women's Trade Union League was an association which helped the young women who'd walked out picket and fend off thugs and police intimidation. And the poor working conditions wasn't something that just employees at the Triangle factory were dealing with. It was a citywide, countrywide problem. And after a woman called Clara Lemlich was beaten by thugs, she made this inspiring speech inspiring thousands more garment workers across NYC to join the strike in something known as the Uprising of 20,000. Although now it is estimated that as many as 40,000 people participated in this strike in total. A lot of these women joined the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and the strike lasted for 14 weeks. Eventually, the ILGWU negotiated a settlement with many factory owners in which they won concessions on wages and working conditions, but Blank and Harris of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory refused to sign the agreement and went on business as usual, even though the strike started when people walked out of their own factory. Due to many of the workers being young immigrant women who were intimidated by the idea of becoming unemployed, scared of the legalities of a new country and the alien surroundings, they just went back to work, knowing that speaking out further would likely cause them to lose their jobs, and that just wasn't really an option for them. Whilst many of the workers had joined the ILGWU, the Triangle factory remained a non-union shop. It was about 4:45 on March 25, 1911, just as employees were finishing their shifts for the day and about to leave the factory, when a fire started on the 8th floor. They got to finish a tad earlier on Saturday, the bell ringing at 4:45 PM to signal that it was time for people to go home. It was just 3 minutes after this, at 4:48 PM, that the fire alarm was sounded in the city's firehouses after being alerted by a passerby in Washington Place who saw smoke coming from the 8th floor of the Ash Building. At 4:50, the first officer in command arrived at the building and sent in a second alarm, then a third alarm, and then a fourth alarm. At the end of each working day, the employees were filed towards the Green Street exit of the building. Being on the corner of Washington and Green, there was naturally one entrance and exit that led to Green Street and one that led to Washington. Only the doorway down to Washington Street side was always kept locked, so people had no choice but to head to Green Street, going down via stairs or the lift. The reason for this was so a watchman could check each person's handbag on their way out to make sure they hadn't stolen anything, lace, threads, fabric cut-offs. It was never an option to go down via the Washington Street exit. There was also a fire escape on the northern side of the building, in the middle of the wall on the outside, but obviously that was only for emergencies. You couldn't use it to go down at the end of the day. The stairway leading to Washington Street, had it been accessible, went up to the 10th floor of the building, but it stopped there, whilst the Green Street stairway went all the way to the roof, and obviously both led right down to the street. It's important to have an understanding of this to understand how this tragedy happened. It's all about the doors. With the fire now burning on the 8th floor, there were cries of fire and people started to run in every direction. The fire had started on the Green Street side of the building, but with that being the standard exit, out of habit, people automatically ran towards the fire instead of away from it in an attempt to escape the building. But it wasn't easy to manoeuvre the 8th floor to even attempt to get to the exit anyway. There were these big cutters tables down the end of the room, basically the tables where the workers would cut their fabric. And underneath the tables there were these big long metal troughs which were designed to throw your scraps into once you'd cut them. At the time the fire started, there was a considerable amount of scraps in these troughs, which you would think would be understandable with it being the end of the day and all. But no, it wasn't just scraps from the day, there were 2 months worth of cuttings under there. Once the fire started, it spread with great speed, the cuttings underneath the tables igniting and spreading it incredibly quickly. The scraps acted like kindling. It would have been almost impossible to get the fire under control before it started spreading. There are only a few buckets of water on hand to help douse the flames, and it wasn't enough to put them out. In fact, one woman who was working there that day and survived happened to know that some of the water buckets near a station were actually empty. Even the minimal fire safety wasn't met. But something that you wouldn't necessarily expect is that most people on the 8th floor were able to escape. They were obviously immediately alerted when the fire started and were able to escape down the stairs before it got really bad. But with no fire alarm system in the building, there was no way to warn people on the 9th floor what was going on. They were able to contact employees on the 10th floor via telephone, but for the people on the 9th, they had no idea there was a fire until it arrived there itself. And it was for this reason that most of the fatalities came from the 9th floor. This floor did have a number of exits, including 2 freight lifts, a fire escape on the outside of the building, and the 2 stairways down to Green Street and Washington Place. Although, as we've established, the stairway down to Washington was closed. It took just 3 minutes for the stairway down to Green Street to become fully engulfed in flames, meaning that people couldn't escape via that route. Some people squeezed into the lift, determined to get to the bottom before the fire took over. Some ended up even jumping down the lift shaft. 25 bodies were found in there, just in an attempt to get down to the bottom. Employees clambered onto the fire escape, but it broke under the weight and the heat. It twisted away from the building and 20 people fell 30 metres to their deaths, dying upon impact with the concrete pavement. Some speculate they may have even been broken before the fire, but we'll never know because it wasn't required to be checked regularly. The Triangle Shirt Company had done their part just by installing it. They didn't need to do anything more than that. People tried desperately to escape out of the Washington Place door, but of course it was locked, and the lone foreman who held the key had already escaped the building. No matter how hard they tried to pull the door open, it just wouldn't. And all of the rest of the doors opened inwards, making it possible for the onrush of workers to open the doors. So the workers were trapped. Their choices were either to succumb to the heat and smoke and die in the building, or jump out of the windows and hope that you either miraculously survive the fall with little injury or die upon impact. Some did make the very smart split-second choice to head up the stairway to the roof when they realised it's possible to make it down, and this actually saved their lives. A lot of people waited on the roof until they could be saved, hoping that the building just didn't crumble underneath them. But most people weren't that lucky, and soon the fire made it impossible to make that choice. An excerpt from an article in the Chicago Sunday Tribune just the day after the fire reads, "Women and girl machine operators jumped from the 8th, 9th and 10th floors in groups of 2s and 3s into life nets, and their bodies spun downward from the high windows of the building so close together that the few nets soon were broken, and the firemen and passersby who helped them were crushed to the pavement by the rain of falling bodies." Within a few minutes after the first cry of fire had been yelled on the 8th floor of the building, 53 were lying half nude on the pavement. Bare legs in some cases were burned a dark brown, and waists and skirts and tattoos showed they had been torn in panic within the building before the girls got to the windows to jump to death. The mangled bodies lay there with the spill of the water which the firemen soon were pouring from water towers and hoses into the building, soaking them. There was no time to clear away the dead in the street. Inside the building, the firemen believed there were dozens upon dozens of girls and men, and they wasted no time upon those whom they knew to be dead. Of course, as you can tell from this article, firemen rushed to the scene to help, but they were unable to be of much help. Their ladders didn't reach above the 6th floor, and nor did their water hoses. They started holding out nets below the windows in an attempt to catch the people falling from the height, but the nets were too weak and they broke upon impact. Survivors reported seeing firemen in tears as they witnessed what was going on, powerless to help. One lucky woman was saved when she jumped out the window and her coat just happened to catch on a hook at the 6th floor. She remained there just hanging on the side of the building for a while and was eventually retrieved safe and sound. One group of men, these heroes, made a human ladder in an attempt to help people at the next windows cross over to the next building, but all 10 men fell and died. 2 law students from the building next door saw the fire break out and decided to head to the roof of their own building to see what they could do to help. It was Charles T. Kramer and Elias Cantor. They took 2 short ladders to the roof with them and made a makeshift extension ladder. Kramer got down to the roof of the burning building, which was a story shorter, and saved 150 women, girls and men who had managed to escape to the roof. It reminds me of the saying, whenever there's a tragedy, look for the helpers. There will always be people trying to help, and these 2 men saved 150 people from the roof. The whole ordeal lasted just 18 minutes, in which time 146 people died, 123 women and 23 men. When they were eventually able to make their way up to the 8th, 9th and 10th floors, there was little left apart from charred fabrics, machinery and bodies. The captain of the New York Fire Department later said of his initial survey of the 9th floor, "I stepped on something that was soft and later realised it was a body, unrecognisable." 36 people were dead in the lift shaft, about 60 were dead on the pavement after jumping from the windows, and the rest died in the fire, burned alive from smoke inhalation. The youngest victims were 14-year-olds Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese. The oldest was 43-year-old Providenza Pano. Bodies were taken to the Charities Pier on 26th Street and the East River, where a temporary morgue was erected. Family and friends simply had to wait to see if their loved ones returned home that evening. Most of them were just teenage girls. If they didn't return home, then off they went to the morgue to see if they could find their body. Identification of a corpse is never going to be a nice job at the best of times, even worse when they're burned beyond recognition. 140 bodies were successfully identified and returned to their families for burial, but 6, 5 women and 1 man, remained unidentified for 100 years. They were eventually buried in the cemetery of the Evergreens on the border of Brooklyn and Queens. There's a stone monument to the workers who died in the fire, a figure of a kneeling woman with her head bowed, and the unidentified were buried underneath her. They were actually finally reunited with their identities in 2011 thanks to a researcher called Michael Hirsch, who became obsessed with learning about the victims who found out one of them had lived in his block in the East Village. After the fire marshal was of course quickly called in to assess the fire's origin. He interviewed the owner of the building, the company and 13 other people to help him draw a conclusion, which was in the end that the fire hadn't been caused by an explosion or arson. A lighted match was likely thrown into waste into the clippings under cutting table number 2 on the Green Street side of the 8th floor. There was a rule that no smoking was allowed on the factory floors, but this was a rule that was broken often. The workers would sneak cigarettes and blow the smoke into their lapels so they weren't caught. The marshal proved that this smoking took place by providing many cigarette cases that he'd picked up near the fire's origin. The building and company owners denied that the doors down to Washington Place were locked, but the fire chief said that if they weren't locked, they were at least closed so firmly that the only way they could get through was with an axe. These were firemen trying to get into the building, and even they couldn't open the Washington Place door. On April 5th, the ILGWU organised a massive funeral procession to honour the victims of the fire, which at this point had been taken countrywide as an affront to all factory workers. What happened at Triangle was tragic, but it just as easily could have happened literally anywhere else. Things had to change. 120,000 people marched on the rainy morning and 300,000 people lined the streets of Manhattan to watch the funeral parade. It took at least 4 hours to pass. On April 11th, 1911, both Max Planck and Isaac Harris, who both survived the fire by fleeing to the roof themselves, were indicted on charges of first and second degree manslaughter under Section 80 of the Labour Code, which mandated that doors should not be locked during working hours. They declared in many interviews that the building was fireproof and it had only just been approved by the Department of Buildings, so they couldn't be guilty. Their trial began on the 4th of December that same year, and the main contention of the trial was whether or not the doors to the Washington Place entrance and exit were indeed locked. If they had been able to open, then it's likely this whole tragedy could have been avoided. People would have just exited the building in an orderly manner to Washington Place, and nobody, or much less people, would have been killed. They also didn't provide a sufficient fire escape, which, like I said, buckled under the weight of the people and the heat. Blank and Harris, of course, denied everything. They said that the door was never locked, something which many employees completely rebuffed in their testimonies. The prosecution argued that the doors were always kept locked during work hours, and I don't think that could be argued after so many people contended, so many employees at the factory said that they were indeed always locked. But the defence argued that they hadn't been able to prove that the owners were aware of this. If the owners weren't aware, then it wasn't their fault. The transcripts of this trial go on for 2,203 pages, but they are on the internet in full. If you're intrigued and want to give them a read, then they will be linked in the description box down below. They're definitely worth read if you're interested in law or want to delve into this case further, but it's just, I mean, it's a lot, 2,000 pages. Eventually, the jury acquitted both men of first and second degree manslaughter. 146 people died and no justice was served. They offered to pay just 1 week's wages to the families of the victims as compensation. Eventually, 23 individual civil suits were brought against Harris and Blank, and on March 11th, 1914, 3 years later, they settled, paying just $75 to each of the 23 families who had sued, which would equal to just under $2,000 today, which I would say is almost offensive. Especially considering that 0 lessons were learned. Just a few days after the fire, the new premises of the factory, because of course the most important thing was just getting back to business here, was found not to be fireproof, with no fire escapes and inadequate exits. Again, just a few days after 146 of their employees have died in a fire. And then in August 1914, Max Blank was charged with locking one of the doors of his factory during work hours. He was fined $20 and the judge apologised for the imposition. In December 1913, the inside of his factory was found to have rubbish piles 6 foot high and scraps of fabric kept in incredibly flammable wicker baskets. And he was just given a warning. Max Blank learned nothing. Triangle Waste Company continued operating until 1918, and throughout this time Blank and Harris insisted that their factory was the model of cleanliness and sanitary conditions, but not fire safe, of course. It wasn't until the 25th of March 2011 that the full list of names of 146 dead was finally read at the 100-year commemoration of the fire outside the building in Greenwich Village. At 4:45 p.m, hundreds of bells rang out across the nation, marking the moment the fire likely started. The building still stands today and is known as the Brown Building, owned by New York University. There are still annual demonstrations held outside the Brown Building, union events, mostly women workers, to emphasise the importance of safety in the workplace. It's one of the largest symbols of the importance of a safe workplace environment, and it was the deadliest workplace tragedy in New York's history until the 9/11 attacks 90 years later. The building's been designated a National Historic Landmark and a New York City landmark. As terrible as the disaster was, it did mark a change in the nation's effort to address workplace safety. If it hadn't been the fire at the Triangle, it would have been another fire or workplace disaster that made people jump into action. It was only a matter of time. Back in 1911, 50,000 working men and women were killed annually in the United States. That's 136 a day. More than that died on March 25th in just one building in Manhattan alone. Just a few months later, the American Society of Safety Engineers was established, which is now the USA's oldest professional safety society dedicated to protecting workers in every industry across every state. It was started by a concerned group of insurance company safety engineers concerned for their own safety in the aftermath. The fire led to legislation that required factories to improve their safety standards, and the work of occupational safety and health professionals over the years has contributed to a dramatic drop in workplace injuries. The fire led to legislation that required factories to improve their safety standards, and the work of occupational safety and health professionals over the years has contributed to a dramatic drop in workplace injuries, illness, and fatalities. New York State also created the Factory Investigating Commission to, as you'll probably guess, investigate factories, make sure they're doing everything they should be in terms of health and safety in the workplace. In the aftermath, more than 200 factories are identified where conditions could have led to something similar to the Triangle Factory fire, and things were changed. A woman called Frances Perkins was an eyewitness to the fire. She was at tea with a group of friends when they were told of a fire nearby, and they rushed to the square to see what was going on. They witnessed the building ablaze. They saw the people falling from the windows, but at the time mistook them for workers throwing fabric out of the windows. It was only later that they realised what it was. Frances was so deeply traumatised by what she'd seen, as were so many people. She was already a person who lobbied for workers' rights and on behalf of the poor, but after seeing the fire, this became the focal point of her life, determined to make a difference. So she gets involved with politics, knowing that this was truly the only way to make a difference from the inside out. She lobbied for new legislation like the 54-hour bill to grant workers shorter hours in a work week. She later went on to become the United States Secretary of Labour. Just seeing this fire change the entire trajectory of her life, she went on to make so many positive changes for the working class and probably saved thousands of lives in the process. This is why history fascinates me so much. One worker probably thought they'd have a quick cigarette before they left work for the day, the match ended up in the cuttings, and it changed the course of the USA and probably the world. So many lives were tragically ended by this fire, but inadvertently so many more were saved because of the fire. Of course, it's always better if things like this don't happen. It would be wonderful if Harris and Blank didn't lock the only other exit in the building, and hindsight is 2020. But now, because of this, there are numerous laws and rules in place to ensure that this never happens again, and I hope to God it doesn't. But there will always be other things, new things to learn and grow from. These are amongst my favourite cases to learn about, small pieces of history that changed the course of the world for so many. If you like this video, then you might enjoy my video on the Radium Girls as well, which is about similar factories in very poor conditions leading to many, many lives lost. Please let me know if you know of any other stories similar to this. I would love to learn more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.